Um, Good evening, good afternoon to everybody joining from wherever you are. Thank you very much. And yes, and good morning. We're very, very pleased to have today with you Steve Davies, who is a trade unionist turning academic, but that never stopped being a trade unionist. He's a honorary research fellow at Cardiff University. He also taught in the early years of the Global Labour University. He was actually my professor. So I'm extremely happy to have Steve with us today to speak about a topic that we have been touching upon throughout all the sessions, and that's the topic of public ethos. So we are very happy to have Steve today to kind of unpack the topic of public ethos and how that can actually be used for organizing. So, Steve, if you can tell us a bit about the history, where does it come from as a topic, and that would it be some ways of how public ethos is manifested? So, if you want to put it in some sort of um, operational framework, how would we pursue this framework of public ethos? And thank you very much for the time to join us.
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me. It's always great to catch up with the Glue comrades, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion now. I'm just going to put a very brief introduction to hopefully spark off more of a discussion amongst us all. Um, the idea of public service ethos might seem a little dry, a little theoretical, a topic of not much relevance to the practical side of public sector trade unionism in terms of bargaining, organizing, mobilizing, and so on. But I hope to show why that's not the case and why it's important as a potentially useful tool for trade unions. A lot of what I'm going to say is based on UK research, British research, but it should have a relevance beyond. And some of the things you'll see parallels with what goes on in your country, and perhaps more interesting, some of the things that will show completely different to what goes on in the UK, both of which will be a useful basis for a discussion. So the story of the PSE covers quite a wide range of areas, which it might not be obvious from the beginning. So it's tied up with the growth of the state. It's also very closely linked in certainly in the British case, and also in others too, I think, with the attempt to stop corruption and nepotism within the state structures. Um, it's clearly linked in with the expansion and then decline relatively, certainly in the UK and many other countries, of the public sector. So there's a kind of arc of the growth of the public sector, then the decline of the public sector. And within that, the rise of trade unions and their present difficulties in most parts of the world. It's very much linked in with the fight for democracy and the possibility of radical social change. So there's a lot of things in this package when we talk about the public service ethos. And it's not that easy to define because it's used quite broadly, and there are lots of different definitions around, but there are two broad traditions within those definitions. One is a kind of utilitarian approach, and one is a more radical approach. So the first one, what I've called a utilitarian approach, is usually associated with the kind of the state. So in terms of, in the British sense, it was in terms of the need for the imperial state, the biggest empire in the world at the time, to have some kind of reliable, loyal cadre of civil servants, army, and various other aspects of the state that wasn't corrupt, that did have a loyalty to the state, to the monarch, to the empire, with appointments broadly based on published criteria rather than the fact that you were the third cousin of the Marquis of Aylesbury or something. And that was a kind of mid-19th century, I think, which I'll talk about in a second. The other strain, the other tradition, is a more radical democratic tradition linked to the development of the franchise and emphasizing a commitment to public service and accountability and the public good. Those run side by side in many cases and often conflict. To go back to the first one for a second, the origin in the UK was, like many social changes, around a war. It was the Crimean War, which involved four empires, with the French, British, Russian, and Ottoman empires in a clash in the Crimea. And regardless of the result of that war, which is not the most important thing, at the end of it, the British reviewed their poor performance, and they put it down to corruption and nepotism within the state structures, which produced incompetence. So they wanted to make sure that the imperial state was competent. They couldn't afford to have an empire run by, as somebody put it, idiots and invalids. So they wanted to make sure that they had a functioning kind of secretariat and an efficient army. So that was why they brought in something around this idea of the public service ethos, and they needed for this strong imperial state. At the same time as that, the Labour movement was on the rise in the UK and demanding all sorts of changes. Demanding the right to vote was primarily one of them, democratic rights, but also demanding things like, just jobs, better standards of life, education for children, and so on. And that became linked in with the expansion of the public sector and the struggle for social reform. So that became, from very early on, part of the conflicting, contrasting motives around both the growth of the public sector and the idea of the public service ethos. This whole idea of where the line is drawn between the market and the public sector anyway is a continually shifting one, which has nothing to do with any technocratic analysis. Obviously, it's a political debate, which we're still having now. And they had that too in the UK in the mid-19th century. So, as I said, this imperial state decided it required a number of services that were not provided or were only inadequately provided by the market. So they needed a literate workforce. They needed to move rapidly to a more developed form of industrialization, which required literacy in the workforce. They needed a healthy workforce. They needed a reliable functioning state bureaucracy. They needed fuel and power for industrialization and clean water for the growing cities. All of those came out of a growing public sector. And many of those were also objectives of the growing labor movement, but from a different angle. Just to take two examples to show you what I mean. Around this time, there was the beginning of the development of public libraries in Britain. And also towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was the introduction of school meals for children in schools. Now, the state wanted those for completely different reasons to the reasons for the labor movement. They agreed on the need for them, but the reasoning behind them was totally different. For example, the reason they introduced school meals in Britain from the ruling class's point of view was primarily because of the very poor caliber, the very poor health of recruits to the British Army in the Boer War, which was a war, as you probably know, in South Africa between the British Empire and the Afrikaner settlers in South Africa, and ran between 1899 and 1902. And the recruits to the British Army, only 1 out of 9 was actually fit enough to be in the army. So the quality of health for working class people in Britain was so low that the state agreed that they should introduce school meals to improve the health of the cannon fodder that they wanted in a few years' time. So that was the reason for the state doing. The reason for the labor movement getting behind it was obviously totally different. They wanted their children to be healthy and well fed. Second of all, the libraries, again, this was a different perspective from both the ruling class and the labor movement. The ruling class wanted two things out of public libraries: a literate workforce to go with the limited schooling that was going on at the time, but they wanted to encourage literacy amongst the working class. And they also wanted to have an alternative to the alcohol-based entertainment of most working class areas in terms of pubs and so on. So they wanted to see a spread of libraries. There would be a kind of a different pole of attraction for workers after work, and would also allow them to improve their literacy skills. Now, the labor movement wanted that for totally different reasons. They wanted.
Sorry for that, Steve. If you can put it up.
Okay. So the labor movement wanted libraries. They saw this as the democratization of knowledge. They saw it as a push towards a better world, a more democratic world. So you can see straight away the state was a site of contestation, even in its earliest shift from this idea of a night watchman state to a more of a welfare, the early years of a welfare state. And for many years in the UK, there was a broadly shared idea amongst the employers, the state, the workers, that the public service ethos was a good thing. Now, the reasons they might have supported that might have been different, but they broadly accepted that the public service ethos A existed and B was good. With the election of Margaret Thatcher and the beginning of what we now see as the neoliberal period, which we're kind of broadly still in, last 40 odd years, this began to change. The public sector was seen by this new group as a kind of nascent form of socialism. In fact, Thatcher called the public sector one of the pillars of socialism, along with the trade unions. Now, obviously, there's some exaggeration here, and not all parts of the state are a pillar of socialism. If that was true, the Israeli Defense Force would be some kind of socialist organization. So it's not true that every part of the state is a kind of proto-socialist feature. But where they are right, where they were hitting the nail on the head in a way, was this idea that there was a non-commodified part of the economy, and they wanted to see the line changed between the non-commodified and the commodified parts of the economy. So that line between the market and the state, they wanted to shift so that the state was reduced in its influence. And they set out to change this with privatization, contracting out, marketization, which really means the creation of proxy markets where you can't create actual markets within the public sector. These are all things no doubt you're very familiar with. And suddenly the workers saw, probably not suddenly, but gradually the workers saw that the shared idea of a public service ethos was no longer the case. The employers no longer adhered to that. They replaced it with this idea of market principles. And the only people who had any commitment, it seemed, to this idea of a public service ethos were the workers themselves. They retained this commitment, most notably in areas like health and education, but also beyond that, in areas like energy, transport, local government, civil service, and so on. Now, while this is taking place, while the assault on the public services was taking place, the contraction of the public sector, the growth of market measures within what was left of the public sector, unions in general, but particularly in the public services, were under a massive attack, and they were effectively under attack for decades, really, and they're still feeling the effects of that today. And there's a massive hemorrhage of members. The strength of unions declined. But what was interesting was that the fact that the workers retained this commitment to the public service ethos, even if they didn't articulate it in those terms, they retained a commitment to the idea that the services they provided were a public good. And they weren't blind to the criticisms that could be made of those, which were often bureaucratic and undemocratic. But nevertheless, the basic idea of provision, of collective provision of services to the people as a whole was seen as a progressive thing, was seen as a public good. So the unions suddenly found themselves in a way as the only group or the only organized group who was articulating this idea. And it became almost unnoticeably a part of their campaigning in areas that were very specific on pay or conditions or things like that. And the idea of using the public service ethos as a campaigning tool, as an organizing tool within, and as a campaigning tool without, was a more and more common aspect of trade union work. So we've recently had a strike wave in the UK for the first time in over a decade. Wasn't a huge strike wave, but it was considerably more than we've had for many years. And this was predominantly focused on the cost of living and pay. But interestingly, in all of the areas that were affected, and they were in areas like education, health, transport, particularly in rail, all of the unions used this idea of the quality of service as an important part of their campaign. So it wasn't just about we need more pay for our train drivers, or we need more pay for the nurses, or we shouldn't have to do so much overtime, or whatever. It was also, and we need that in order to provide a better service. And these are our criticisms of the quality of service and so on. So it became a big part of the campaign. And it succeeded in building coalitions outside the workplace. So that they were able to cohere the workforce within the workplace around this idea, and also reach out beyond the workplace to the service users and to create coalitions and alliances with people outside the workplace. Now, the importance of this was that it prevented the employers from using the service users against the workers. It was a massive PR disaster for the employers and for the government, who tried very hard to demonize strikers, particularly in health and in transport, as jeopardizing people's lives or jeopardizing their ability to go to work and so on. And they completely failed. All the opinion polling showed that the general public was very supportive of the rail strikers and the health workers and the teachers and so on. So this was a really important strategic turn by the unions, which played a big part in their ability to maintain a campaign for so long. So I think the important thing about the public service ethos in Britain, and I'd be interested to hear your views as to whether you think there's any relevance to the situation in your countries, is that this is something that's existed for a long time. It's been pretty it's been pretty roughly agreed between employers and workers for decades. Now that's not true. The workers seem to be the only ones still holding to that position. And it has become a useful tool in both mobilizing the membership you have, organizing outside the membership you have to recruit, but also extending it beyond the workplace to build coalitions outside. And not only that, but it straight away raises the issue of, if you have criticisms about the quality of service, what is your solution? What is your proposal? What is your prospectus for a better type of service? So it forces unions to think about a different way of organizing the service itself. And in a way, that goes right back to this idea of the early socialists in the 19th century, who saw the potential of the public service ethos of building the society of tomorrow on the basis of some of the ideas and practices we see today. So it's a kind of way of showing to people that there's a different way of organizing society, as well as a bread and butter way of fighting for improvements at work. So there's a few things in there that might be relevant to you. Hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion. I'll be interested to hear what the situations are in your different sectors and countries, and whether there's any crossover or any resonance with what I've described as being taking place in parts of the UK. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Steve. Really excellent inputs, very inspiring. And I would open actually straight for questions or comments everybody could have. Please turn the cameras on if you can, and add the country you're from after the name. And who would like to take the floor first for a question or a comment? Steve's input on public ethos. While people are warming up, perhaps, may I ask you something, Steve, on there seem to be, I mean, you would say for different motivations, but like this trying to do something for the public service and making more of them more accessible and even expanding them could be done for different reasons. So we saw that in the utilitarian approach. But could you say, could you give an example, and perhaps one of the examples was what you gave, but where the two come head to head and conflict each other? Because if both want to have at the end the same result, one could say it doesn't matter, you know, how they want to achieve it. It's important that at the end we have public services for all, or expansion of food programs for the children at schools and public libraries and so on. In what way would you say that there could be really a conflict also in the results of what they pursue, because of what are the reasons for them pursuing that particular objective? If you know what I mean. I mean, my understanding is that with this example on public transport that you mentioned and public health, the strikes that happened in transport and health, you could see there the government perhaps trying to misuse sort of a public ethos discussion to say, oh, you are disrupting the life of the population and so on. But could you, more fundamentally, how are these two different in terms of the results that they lead to, one path or the other?
Well, I think if I understand the question correctly, I think there is often a potential for conflict between the service providers and the service users, right? And there is one of the criticisms of interestingly, from the right has always been that the public sector is a vested interest in itself, and it only really exists in order to reward those who work within it. It's not really a public service in that sense, and that's why you should privatize it, because the market is more responsive to the needs of the public, right? Well, okay, you all will be able to shoot that one down pretty easily, but that's not to say that there aren't genuine potential conflicts between service users and service providers. And I think the only real answer to that is engagement by the union and with service users, and also to try and win the political argument. So in terms of in the UK, the political argument has been won by the rail unions. So they know that they have public support in their argument that the rail system is dysfunctional, it's underfunded, it's being looted effectively by private companies. Even though there's a public subsidy, it goes straight out, goes in one door and straight out the other door into the profits of private companies, and there's not enough investment. The quality of the service is poor. There's fewer trains than there were, and so on. You can run through all of these things, and the rail unions have been running a campaign on that for a long time. So when they say this is what we stand with the rail users on this, even though we're going to stop you going to work tomorrow because we're going to go on strike, they still seem to have managed to balance that and keep people with them. Not everybody, obviously, but they've mostly kept a majority of the public on side, which is a phenomenal thing, really, because they ran a campaign that lasted over a year, where there was episodic strikes, and obviously these are inconvenient for people. And the government was trying to make as much political damage for the union as possible in that. And not only that, but they'd said to the rail companies that we will subsidize you all of your losses through the strikes so that you can stand up to the unions, because we can't allow the unions to win. So even despite all of that, they still won public opinion to their side. Now, you have to go beyond that, really, because the eventual settlement of that dispute was not a fantastic settlement, but it was better than it would have been had they not gone on strike. But I think what they're trying to argue is to take it up a level and say what we need is to bring public ownership back to the rail system, but not in the old way where it was plenty of criticism of it, but to make it a more democratic, more user-friendly, more geared towards some kind of system where there is an input from service users as well as workers in the industry itself. So I think there's a big political debate. This is a long-winded way of saying there's a big political debate to be had there to overcome conflicts, potential conflicts with service users, I think.
Thank you very much. And we have Coffee raising his hand and waiting patiently. So Coffee.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone from Ghana. I think it's an interesting terminology, and I strongly believe that with the history of the trade union, that has been the backbone of our activities. But talking from the experience we have in Ghana, maybe Steve will help to come up with some strategies that we can employ to help. You know, the kind of politics we play in this side of the world makes it quite difficult for the public service ethos to be harnessed. That is why I'm asking whether there could be strategies that the unions can employ, because the services that we are rendering to the people, in most cases, they are too politicized to the extent that when one party is in government and is able to institute things that will help, when you are strategizing how best to help make sure that the people become the beneficiary, another party comes and they distort the whole progress. And so when it comes to health, when it comes to education, and all these areas, we have suffered some of these things. And becoming a new direction that we all need, I would want to find out from Steve, finding ourselves in such a political atmosphere, are there any particular strategies the unions can employ that, devoid of the fact that it is becoming too much partisan politics in dealing with public service, we the unions can actually maneuver and then still make sure that integrity and service to the people becomes the ultimate goal? So that is my comment and then question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Coffee.
Do you want me to come back on that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you come back on that and then we see if somebody raises their hand.
Okay. Right. Okay. I think this is what you've described is not an unusual problem, in that there is a kind of tradition in not tradition. I mean, there's examples of the sort of things you described all over the world. I don't think it's a particular problem in Ghana, and you even in the Americans actually have a phrase for it, pork barrel politics, where you essentially, the winning party will hand out all sorts of gifts effectively by virtue of its control of the state machine, whether that's at a state or a federal basis. So, you know, that this is a genuine problem, I think, and to a certain degree, I suppose when I was talking about the origin of this in the UK, they had a kind of version of that, I suppose, but it wasn't really a partisan party thing. It was a kind of ruling class, the sons and daughters of the aristocracy who were, you know, completely unqualified to do certain things, but were getting big jobs within the bureaucracy and within the armed forces simply by being family members. That's a slightly different thing, but it's not totally unrelated, and it's the same sort of idea of patronage and nepotism that doesn't relate to, as you said, benefiting the people. So I think what unions have to do is to show that they are on the side of democratic, responsive public services which represent the needs of the people. So that has to be, in the first place, I suppose, you have to have structures and procedures that are not influenceable by every single change of every general election. So that if one party gets in one week and another party gets in next year, then everything changes and the whole system is turned upside down. You have to have some kind of agreed continuity of procedures and so on. But the main thing I would have thought is that there would be a barrier to that kind of corruption, even if it's not illegal. It's a kind of moral corruption, even if it's legal. Is to have the input of the people in some direct way. So when unions talk about the democratization of public services, they shouldn't, in my view, just mean the input of the workers within that particular sector or service, but also the service users as well. Now, that's not always easy to do, but there are ways of doing it. And there's been parts of the world where there's been attempts to have some kind of participatory engagement with public services. So I think that's not an easy answer. It's a hard task, I think, to overcome some of those barriers, but they are political barriers and you need a political response to them, I think.
Thanks, Steve. Somebody else would like to make a question or a comment? Yes, Nitu.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Esther, for your nice presentation and the discussion. Actually, I heard some of the information from you, but I have no any particular question, but I have some few comments because when we are talking about the future is public, that means the contextually in Bangladesh, we are now facing that everything is now in state-owned enterprise, and we will not get any types of sectors or services which is very much closest to the public. This is very much challenging for us actually, and Sister Ilya also know that the phenomenon of Bangladesh because such kind of discussion we made last 2 years before, and it is very much challenging in Bangladesh because from 1982, actually state decided that the all public sector need to be enterprise, and that's why right now all types of sectors divided decline and the support becoming less from the government side. And another part is here that few of the areas were very much strong trade union, like the jute mill. But unfortunately, last 2 years back, this sector also collapsed, and government also decided that this sector will be closed by the government support. But right now, we are looking that government has also taken some initiative to again run this jute mills by private sector cooperation and PPT. So such kind of things is happening in here, and Steve also mentioned that there are some political dilemma in here because sometimes some government are thinking that there are some challenges because you have already mentioned that the few of the areas are becoming, they are also facing challenges like the corruption. Sometimes government also trying to to find some of the problem, but the number of workers are also declined such kind of sectors as well. So that the problem is becoming high. We have a strong example in here in Bangladesh. Looks like a train, railway. Still, railway is the public sector, and all types of people they are moving one place to another place on a very cheap prices. The government took some of the initiative for privatization in this sector, but for a strong trade union movement, and trade union also raised their voice. That's why so far it is still in public sector, and we are we are very much benefited from this. And like those sectors, we are also expecting that a few of the areas will be expanded, like education, energy. But unfortunately, it is very much difficult in here. But our trade union also discussing these issues in their different forums, and hopefully that such kind of political dilemma will be the change, and maybe some of the sectors will be more covered by the public sector. And of course, we should also think, and we should also talk that the future is public. These are my comments, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Steve, shall we perhaps take one more question and then you can do both? Okay, Comrade Wezi, please. Wezi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, comrades. Thank you so much, Steve, for a very nice presentation. Actually, what you have shared today is a reflective of what is happening in many countries, including Malawi. What we're experiencing now is that the service delivery in public services is being eroded by privatization of several of state-owned enterprises, to the extent that when you look at the remuneration in public services at the moment is not something which is regarded as a motivating factor to most public service employees. And when you look at the bargaining mechanisms, they feel very restrictive, such that it's quite difficult that you have them work as hard as in the private sector. So I've seen that the privatization of several state enterprises has eroded the hardworking spirit of most public servants, in which most of the work ethics of the majority seem to have receded in a way that most probably look at the public service not as something which one could give much time and dedication because of the accompanying compensation. I thought I should bring that to the attention of Stephen and the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Wezi. Steve, perhaps you may want to reflect or comment on comments and questions that were made, and then we take Fato and Nicola. You're still muted somehow. Okay.
Sorry. Both the comrades from Bangladesh and Malawi made some really interesting points about the conditions in their country, and I think I can see lots of parallels with the UK already in what they've described. I think that, there's also Esso put something in the chat as well, which is I'll try and deal with too. What I think that was said about the spirit of public service workers being damaged after privatization, I think that's a really genuine issue, a real problem, because part of the reason, or a major reason of privatization, is in order for whatever service it is to be provided more cheaply, and almost always that is at the expense of the workers. So it's not surprising if the morale and the spirit of workers deteriorates after privatization, because usually it's because they're treated far worse after privatization. And that is despite accepting that often public sector employers are not the best in the world either. But almost certainly it is the case that privatization leads to a worsening of conditions and pay. So that is very much true in the UK as well as in Malawi. But what we found is that despite that, there is still within some of the privatized areas, like I mentioned rail earlier, which is a privatized area in the UK, there is still an idea amongst the workers that this should not be in the private sector, it should be in the public sector. And so they hold to that view that there is a public service ethos to their work. And quite often their propaganda is, I'll give you a good example, right? They had a campaign recently because the government wanted, or the rail employers wanted to shut down ticket offices all over the country, in stations all over the country. And they said, we don't need ticket offices anymore. Everything's online. What's the matter with you people? You're just Neanderthals living in the dark ages. Why don't you use your smartphone? It'll be good. We won't sack anyone. We'll just redeploy everyone. So why are you complaining? And the union said, well, we're complaining because the service quality will be worse, because not everyone is very at ease with smartphones. The elderly are not. There's issues for people with disabilities who arrive at stations who won't be able to access certain things, and they need somebody, a person, a real human, to be there to help them, and so on. So they ran a campaign on this, and it was got fantastic support from the traveling public, and eventually the employers backed down. So they still see themselves as having this public service ethos, even though they are actually in the private sector, and they see that as a temporary setback, and their aim is to get themselves back into the public sector. So that maybe fits in with some of the things the comrade from Bangladesh was talking about as well. On this one point about what can workers do, besides strikes, well, there are quite a few different things that have been done in different parts of the world in defence of public services that were not, strictly speaking, the same as a strike, and were aimed at maintaining this alliance with service users. So, for example, transport workers in Japan, instead of going on strike, they refused to take fares on the buses. So they let everyone on for free. So obviously all the passengers are very happy about this because they didn't have to pay. But at the same time that the buses still ran, nobody was stopped from going to work or going to see their auntie who was ill in hospital or whatever. So they were, they did that as a deliberate policy of trying to maintain a coalition with service users. So that was one thing. The one thing they did. In Canada, postal workers who were on strike deliberately or specifically looked for pensions checks that were coming from the government and took those out and delivered them, even though they were on strike. So they delivered them to pensioners who were waiting for their money from the government, and they made sure those pensioners didn't lose out on receiving their pension check from the government. When the employers found out what they were doing, they banned them from the sorting office so they couldn't do that. So then the employers got the blame for stopping pensioners getting their pensions, and then they made the pensioners queue up at the sorting office. So the union went along then. It was a very hot day when this happened. The union went along then with umbrellas and chairs and bottles of water, and helped all the pensioners who were in these long queues in the hot sun, and they just laid out chairs and tables for them and umbrellas. So these are unusual forms of industrial action, I suppose, but with a bit of imagination, sometimes you can do things like this, which will help to maintain or develop alliances with service users while still damaging the employer or making a kind of stand against the employer. So I hope that's an answer or a partial answer for Esso's question about what other things you can do.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have 3 hands up. Perhaps may I please ask you, Fatou, in this order that I see you are, Nico and Monirul, to please make the questions short, so we have time. So Steve has time to actually respond to them. So Fatou, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We can't hear you. Can you please try?
My name is Fatou Diouf. I'm from Senegal. I turn off my camera, maybe it's because of the network. Can you hear me now? Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better now. Please.
No.
Continue.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so what I was saying is that I don't have a question. It is a comment on the privatization effect on work.
But you are.
Let me type it in the chat
please
box.
do. Please do type it. I think that's going to be really helpful. Thank you very much. And sorry for that. Nico, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, can you hear me well? Okay. Well, good to see you, Steve. My question is based in the case of Argentina, which unfortunately has become pretty much a debate lately because of the state reforms that President Milei is trying to implement. And my question is actually based on something I was just reading, a very interesting interview to a unionist, Daniel Jope. This is the man who leads the oil sector in Argentina, which has been succeeding very well in their objectives. And he brings what he calls an oily debate. And it's basically whether we are listening. I mean, he's not talking about necessarily about the public sector, but it includes the public sector. If we are listening, those who are angry, actually, if we can, I can put it in a different way. If for the case again of Argentina, where there's a lot of insatisfaction and criticism, the typical neoliberal jargon that criticize public services. But if you're listening, I mean, if we listen to their arguments, whether there's something new in their arguments by criticizing public services, and even if we don't like what users say, if we have a strategy for that, what I mean is, and this is what Joffre said, we've been doing, I mean, let's call progressive forces and eventually union strategies, we've been failing, and that has an impact in the political outcome. But are we changing the arguments we've been using to actually understand and capture whether there's something new in the criticism? Because, and this is the question, much of that criticism is not just random, brainwash. It's rooted in experiences of a devastating or bad services, and obviously that can be based on lack of proper funding, lack of proper salaries, and lack of, and that's very much the case of education and health. But actually, the question is: are we listening new arguments, new ideas, and are we developing union strategies that can capture that? Because otherwise, if we think that people are just stupid or they are manipulated by discourses, we are not behaving very much. I mean, ultimately, we are failing, because even if we are convinced of our own reasons, what if we are still failing? Are we still convinced of what we think, or we need to adjust our ideas to a new, very different area that is also very much rooted in how the algorithm produce, senseless reasons, rationals, etc., etc. Thank you very much, and nice to see you all again.
Thanks a lot, Nico. Monirul, do you want to make your question quickly, please?
Okay, thank you. Can you hearing me? Okay. Okay, I have a few comments and questions. Already a lot of things are mentioned by our brother Mitu. I'd like to add, in Bangladesh context, government insists to privatization from public. So it is this is the government policy in Bangladesh, and also, if I give an example in the health sector, near about 75,000 registered nurse in the health service in Bangladesh. Only near about 30% are engaged in the government public services. Most of the nurses are engaged in the private services. So why? Because in public service, most of the employers, like nurse and other officials, get low wages, and gradually the government reduced the welfare facilities of the public service workers in Bangladesh. But on the what is as because the government gradually show their centralized attitude, and this is why democracy is squeezed. In the other hand, basic goods prices are high. So ultimately, the public are victim by the state.
Comrade, if you can please
Davies,
do
yes, yes, I have a question.
we are only a few
Steve,
minutes left, so
yeah,
please
yeah.
go ahead with
Steve,
the question.
already Steve mentioned a trade union will be declared a strike, but in Bangladesh there is no own funding sources. All the trade union are volunteer. So if they will make a strike, how they will continue? So I would like to ask, what will be the different strategy instead of strike in context of Bangladesh trade union and government situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there is yet another example in the chat box from Senegal. That's what Fatou was giving about the privatization of the water service and how it actually led to total worsening of the service and high satisfaction with the service. Privatization by a French company, I see. So Steve, perhaps if you want to respond to their more comments. Yeah, it's about cutting the workforce actually of people responsible for the water services and people being afraid to actually join the trade unions. So Steve, what would be your comments and feedback to the different experiences of privatization and also the questions made?
First, Fatou, I feel your pain. Water in Britain has been privatized since 1989, and it's been an absolute disaster. And initially, actually, many French companies were involved in that too, because France was one of the few countries that did have a certain amount of privatization in water. And although that's being pushed back even in France now, and there's been a remunicipalization of water services in lots of places in France, including in Paris, where previously it was a privatized service. The privatized service in Britain is now a kind of national joke, in that there's like completely polluted rivers, or lots of the bathing areas in the beaches around the coast are not suitable for humans to go into. Yeah, I mean, this has been an absolute disaster, and also it's been a fantastic way for big companies to loot the public purse to the extent of billions of pounds. So there's a massive movement against that particular privatization. It's very, very unpopular, and any government that offered to bring it back into public ownership would be very, very well supported. Unfortunately, even the what's left of the Social Democratic Party in Britain, the Labour Party, which is completely right-wing these days, is too locked into right-wing neoliberal ideas to even offer that. So what's happening is a massive grassroots campaign is developing against these companies, and really they're under pressure from the public far more so than the politicians, and it's difficult to know where that will go, to be honest, because all the politicians are too scared to go anywhere near it because they're worried about the corporate interests who might take out some strange legal case against them. Whereas a lot of the campaign groups and community organizations are saying, let them go bust and then we can renationalize them for a penny. And I think that's a very popular position at the moment. In terms of what Nico said, I completely agree that, you know, part of what the unions need to do is to listen. We need to listen to not just our own members, but also the people who use the services. And if these structures don't exist to do that, then we should be thinking about how we can create them. And if the alliances don't already exist, then we should be thinking about how they can be built and how we can get that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas to prevent any potential conflicts about what sort of service is being carried out. And I think that that's a win-win from the point of view of the service user and the service provider, the workers in the service. So I think that's a really important point to be made, that the unions have to stop this idea of just holding what they have, which is forever in Britain anyway, forever diminishing. You have to step out of that and go on the offensive politically and organizationally. And I think, that's exactly what I totally agree with what Nico was saying in terms of, to do that, you need to listen.
Okay, so there is a follow-up from Nico. But what if we don't like what they say? and I think that's a fair question too, because I mean, it seems after so many conversations we have had, unless the unions themselves don't go into a process of self-reflection and self-criticism and transformation to actually engage in a meaningful way with the public ethos, we may not actually be able to provide a new vision of the public services, if you like. And there is a question also from Sarbasara, who, Sarbasara, I'm not sure how long were you in the conversation, who still thinks that the concept of public ethos seems to be somehow theoretical and abstract. And how can we understand the trade union leaders in a country like India and how it's linked to organizing and mobilizing? So perhaps, Steve, also as a way of wrapping up, there are many questions still coming up, but if you can try and respond to these questions, and perhaps we can get also your commitment that you would produce for us a video lecture on public ethos, that we could then hopefully put it in the platform and that everybody can engage with the topic and see how the concept can actually be used in different contexts.
Yeah, sure. I think that'd be great. I think from my point of view, if we're talking about transformational approaches to trade unions and to public services, really, I mean, unless we all think that public services, wherever they are great, completely unimprovable, and I doubt there's a single person on this Zoom who believes that, then we need to think about what needs to be transformed and how do we do that. And also, how do we transform the unions as the vehicle or one of the main vehicles for that transformation to take place? And I think that's partly looking inwards and reflecting, as Adlira just said, but it's also about reaching outwards, as well, as Nico said. So it's a kind of two-sided approach where you need to think through what is good about what is currently provided, where the problems are. After all, workers know best where things don't work. They're the ones who do these things, so it's often the bosses who really have no idea how this service works, and the workers really do know how it works. So what you need is to, in a way, empower that knowledge. You need to operationalize that knowledge in a democratic way. And also you need to, the second group who also know how best services work, so the ones who use them. So you need to engage them in part of that process as well. And unions can do this. They've done it to a degree in the past and in some places, and they need to see that as a basic part of looking at how you can build a different form of public services, different form of public sector, where you have the beginnings of tomorrow's society and today, but also you need to see it as a practical bargaining and organizational mobilizing tool, which will allow you to engage your own membership, to strengthen the bond, the cohesion within the union itself, to expand the union, to recruit around the idea of, strengthening the power of the workers, but also strengthening the vision that they have for an alternative. And by doing that kind of dual approach of both bargaining and the vision thing, then you can play a really big role in terms of the transformation that we've talked about. So I think those are quite important things, and we need to kind of not look at it in a one-dimensional way. We need to be thinking about it in a much broader approach.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Really, really important conversation, which I think cannot end here for sure. I think it needs to be a continuous conversation on the topic, and in particular about possible strategies that can be pursued actually to kind of define the public ethos for every sector in every country, because it would mean different things. While the principles may be the same, but it may mean different things in different contexts. So thank you very much, everyone. You saw that we got also a public commitment from Steve to produce a video lecture. We're going to hold him to that promise, and we will for sure develop that. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow in the last workshop.